Usually, I've come to places where management is not involved in the lean thinking or in the elements of a TPM process. They may provide some money and say, okay, go do this, but they're not really involved. And sometimes they're not even willing to invest any time or money. So it's a non-start from the beginning. Why are some of the reasons why they potentially don't want to actually invest in something like a TPM process? Well, typically from the leaders of management, they look for a return. If they don't get the expected return, they're not going to invest in it. And if we don't show a return, they shouldn't invest into it. So obviously, the processes of TPM, when they're implemented, aren't showing returns. Sometimes it's that they can't afford to put their best people on the project. So they don't dedicate resources because they're too busy doing business, creating product or services for their customers. So they don't have time to do this project. And sometimes when they go through the full training of a TPM, if you ever read about or looked at it, it becomes overwhelming and too complex for people to understand this is what you have to do. And then they just give up, shrug their shoulders and not support it. And then when it's not supported, the people underneath don't follow it. So that's some of the reasons that we have seen, but there's more. Let's go back to the idea that this is a project to implement. Well, I think that's a complete mistake. And it's really most of the things I've run across in my career when I talk with clients to help them with lean thinking. They view everything as a project. We want to do SMED, single minute exchange of die. We want to do 5S. Well, let's create a project. Even when you do Kaizen events, it's thought of as a project. And that misses the whole complete point, because if you treat it as a project, there's like a beginning and end. And that's not how my viewpoint of the elements of lean, because the lean are tools that are matched with our behaviors. And those behaviors basically are just how we do things. It's ordinary daily work. It's just the way we do things. That's the lean thinking that will make this run. And if we're thinking about it as a project, you probably have a lower success rate. And then you look at some other common points of the 8 pillars of TPM. If you break down what is being taught under the current TPM processes, let's start with the foundation. Everybody shows the foundation's 5S. Well, if we don't have a solid 5S program, you don't have a solid foundation, then the walls and the roof of your house are going to collapse. They're not going to hold up. So I have found that even basic 5S is not being adhered to or done, and therefore you don't expect a TPM process to actually take hold if you don't have a good solid 5S. So that's one area that needs to make sure that you have in place. And typically, when people implement the TPM, they make the false assumption that they have a solid 5S already in place, and then they just run through the 8 pillars. I think that's one of the mistakes that we make in the failure of trying to put TPM, is we assume that the 5S is solid, and it's not. And then the other one, I don't think it's talked as much as it should, but one of the first things you're taught in TPM is autonomous maintenance, which in itself is not a bad approach or idea, because it's definitely something it's the implementation of that idea that ends up being bad. Because what you do is you essentially, at this point, most companies have all 100% of their maintenance activities done by a maintenance department. And this becomes the observation and shift of trying to have the maintenance work on the skilled, very technical portions of maintenance, and offload some of the easier routine maintenance tasks, like changing oil or doing filter changes or monitors on the machine, to the operator themselves. So there's a shift here of moving work to operators to have them involved in it. I agree 100%. Operators should be involved in the maintenance of the equipment, but it's to what level do we do that? Because if you say it's a shift to the operator, and most managers will say, well, if they're working on the equipment to improve it and maintain it, who is there to run the machine? And that's what we need them for. So there's a big conflict over the role of an operator, and we usually get that wrong when we implement a TPM, because there becomes an overburden on the operators, and they're either not trained well, or they're not incorporated with their main job is to make parts on the machine. So that becomes a stumbling block that is a failure point in TPM, and we want to address that with the uptime thinking that we have.